Welcome to our press event on why nuclear energy is not a climate solution, but a false solution. My name is Sasha Gabizon. I'm here with Women Engaged for a Common Future and with the Women and Gender Constituency, which are over 1,000 women, environmental, climate organizations worldwide. And we are very worried about the propaganda we are hearing and the many false solutions we are being presented here at COP26. We are particularly concerned about the nuclear energy lobby. At COP26, we have today published a document called False Solutions, which you can find on the website of the Women and Gender Constituency. I'm extremely proud to be today here with a panel of experts from all over the world, and I'll be moderating this press event with you. And I have on my left Makoma Lekalakala from EarthLife Africa. On her left, Angelika Claussen of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. On her left, Ayumi Fukakusa of Friends of the Earth Japan. And on her left, Günther Herrmeier of the anti-uranium movement. And on my right, I have Gavin McLadden from the Australian Conservation Foundation. So I would like to start with Günther and ask Günther to present the statement which has been signed by civil society organizations for the COP26. Günther, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Günther Herrmeier. I'm working with Uranium Network and the People's Organization at the nuclear waste site in Gorleben, Germany. And tonight we would like to draw your attention to our statement that we prepared for this COP. In connection with the climate crisis, the nuclear industry, here even more intense than at previous COPs, is trying to present themselves as part of the solution. So that is why we met here tonight. You can find the statement on our website, together, which you can see, together with all the so far 461 signatures from NGOs around the world. Just to give you a short overview on this, our organizations maintain that nuclear is dirty and dangerous, unsustainable, unjust, slow, a security risk, agent or unproven, and not carbon neutral. This is now coming part of the statement. Every dollar investment in nuclear power makes the climate crisis worse by diverting investment from renewable energy technology. Nuclear is increasingly unsafe and unreliable in a warming world with more frequent shutdowns and an inability to operate safely under climate change solutions, changed climate conditions. For nuclear weapons tests to radioactive waste facilities, the nuclear industry has a history of displacing, disrupting, damaging the health and rights of workers and communities. Indigenous peoples, black and people of color, face a disproportionate burden and risk from the nuclear industry as mining, waste storage primarily affects on their lands, and they are often not consulted, compensated, or respected. Nuclear is slow, expensive, and dangerous. It is not carbon neutral and poses unique security and waste management risks. We do not have the time to wait for the industry to recover from its own economic failures, overcome construction delays, or to fulfill the false solutions promise of a new technology. That's why we say the future is renewable and not radioactive. Thank you.
Thank you, Günther. And we have indeed all signed up to the statement, and we need to call attention to the fact that the nuclear industry is not a climate solution. And therefore, I will ask now Makoma. You are a social environmental justice activist. You have experienced the situation in your country with the nuclear lobby, and you have a statement for us from South Africa.
Yes.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The buzzword at this conference has been just transition, and just transition reverberates as a word almost in all the halls where the sessions of discussions. a just transition is the only way out of multiple crises that we face: the climate disruption, the collapse of life systems the world over, and growing political and social discontent. Over the past years, we have seen some argue that not only nuclear is the best way to green economies, but also frame it as a technology that will be good for workers. Today, I'm here to launch a publication by Dr. Neil Overy and the Hendrik Boer Foundation, which offers a comprehensive account of why nuclear will be detrimental to our collective capacities to transforming our energy system in a way that leaves no one behind. You can find the publication after the press conference on the website of the Hendrik Boer Stifting, also on the website of the Don't Nuke the Climate, and also from Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. First, a just transition will require stable electricity supplies in the face of extreme weather. It is widely claimed that nuclear power is reliable. However, over the past 5 years, French nuclear power plants have had to shut down for up to 7,000 hours due to climate events. In fact, nuclear's reliance on water for cooling makes it particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The causes for this have ranged from floods to droughts and dramatic temperature rises. Earlier this year, we saw that in the Texas snowstorm, nuclear plants had to be shut down as water pump stations froze. It is also argued that a green energy system will require nuclear for base load. But technology has moved far beyond this. It's been shown that smart grids can draw from a mix of renewables and rest to provide constant energy supply. Secondly, even in unlikely case that nuclear power stations are located in sites that would be impacted by temperature changes, storms, sea level rise, or water scarcity, the lengthy time lag between planning to operation of new plants, which almost take a decade in many cases, means that nuclear energy will be of little help in mitigating emissions in the crucial decade leading up to 2030. Most countries have pledged that they would want to halve their emissions by 2030, at least that's what we've also been hearing in this conference, or what has been included in the national determined contributions. In comparison, utility-scale solar and wind are completed on an average half of that time, 2-3 years from planning to operation, whilst nuclear takes us more than a decade or decades, so to say. There will be no just transition if we fail to decarbonize in the decade leading up to 2030. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is clear that unless we cut emissions by half until 2030, we will miss the 1.5 target, of which in Africa would prefer that no temperature rises at all, 0 targets of temperature rises. We all know that most vulnerable to the climate emergency are those who are already marginalized and who we cannot afford to leave behind. Thirdly, even as a technology that could potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions after 2030 compared to fossil fuels, nuclear costs are prohibitively expensive and make for anti-poor policies. Even before accounting for the nuclear waste management expenses, a new nuclear power costs around 4 times more than the renewables utilities. Such expenses would mean that efforts to address and eliminate energy poverty will fail. In fact, energy poverty will likely increase from where it is now. The precious resources will be diverted from public services like health and education, on which, again, those that we cannot leave behind rely on. It will not be possible to make investments required for a just transition, investment in skills development, industrial programs, small business support programs, and a stronger social safety net, precisely when this will be needed most. We have also seen the exorbitant cost of nuclear crowd out investments in renewables. Fourth, all evidence shows that renewable create more jobs than nuclear, depending on the technology and the job measurements, up to 6 times more. Moreover, not only do renewables create jobs, they also create a wider variety of jobs across more flexible locations rather than centralized. This means that job profiles are accessible to a wider array of people and can be located where they are needed most. And then, despite its enormous expense, the economic stimulus nuclear creates is less than that is created by renewables. The fifth point, which is my last point, is that even if we ignore all above, cost, time, jobs, economic impacts, supply reliability risk, nuclear still provides inferior environmental outcomes. The carbon footprint of nuclear power is at least 2 or 4 times more than that of renewables, and that is still an underestimate. It also creates an intergenerational toxic waste crisis. My final point is that history shows us that the social and economic consequences of a serious accident occurring at a nuclear power station are devastating to both workers and society at large. Such outcomes can hardly be justified by the few jobs that nuclear creates. The above 2 points suggest that nuclear is spectacularly unfit to power a just transition. While the jobs it creates are few and highly skilled for elites, its economic stimuli impacts lesser. Its cost will likely result in austerity policies. Nuclear power is not, has never been, nor will ever become a viable means to generate electricity, especially with the context of the worsening climate emergency. It is obvious via metric that renewable energy is far better option in the meaningful address to carbon emissions to avert a climate catastrophe, a climate disruption, a climate crisis that we find ourselves in, and do so while safeguarding the decent livelihoods and rolling black inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Makoma. I think we have gotten the message from Günther. This is an extractive industry. From you, it is too slow. We can't wait 10, 15 years. It is too expensive. It creates too little jobs. It doesn't create democratic jobs, which are local, which are also jobs for women. And it is a huge risk if something goes wrong. We will now go to Ayumi Fukakusa from Friends of the Earth, Japan. You have seen the disaster of Fukushima. Tell us, what is the situation in Japan?
Thank you so much, Sasha. My name is Ayumi Fukakusa. I am a campaigner for climate justice and energy at Friends of the Earth Japan. Actually, before I speak about the situation in Fukushima, I wanted to speak about the story in Wales because we are in the UK. So 4 years ago, I had a chance to visit this beautiful island called Anglesey Island in Wales. The civil group called People Against Wilfa B, or PAUB, kindly let me stay their place and showed me around this beautiful island and told their stories about long fight against Wilfa B new nuclear power station. People were worried about nuclear accident, nuclear waste, and the future of the island, and they were campaigning very long time while proposing alternative renewable energy future for the island. I visited them because it was a Japanese company called Hitachi was planning to export nuclear power station to the Anglesey Island. So FOE Japan joined them, and the project was finally scrapped. I thank all people, including people here, who have been fighting against dirty energy and congratulate their wins. The other reason, other than people's opposition and people's fight, and the other reason why Hitachi scrapped this project was due to increased cost. Other people already mentioned nuclear is very costly. Hitachi knew that without public financial support, it is impossible to export nuclear power. So the company was seeking support from both UK government and Japanese government, but they failed to get their support. So building nuclear power stations is increasingly costly in many countries, and we don't have much time to stop this climate crisis. Nuclear cannot be a solution to climate crisis, which needs urgent action. And now I would like to talk a bit about Fukushima nuclear crisis. So it's already 10 years have passed since the Fukushima nuclear crisis, but we still face this crisis every day in many aspects. Affected people, there are nearly 30,000 people still evacuated from Fukushima, and people are suffering, and COVID-19 makes things worse in many ways. The damage is extensive and complex, and due to widespread radioactive contamination, people have lost their ways of life that were so close to tied with nature. We cannot afford any other nuclear accident. It took away so many things from us, and people also are being overwhelmed with concern about their health and their own future. In the past few years, Japan actually showed that it is possible to reduce CO2 emissions without nuclear power. In 2014, there was no single nuclear power station operating in Japan, and yet the CO2 emissions started to decrease in 2014, the same year, and it still continued decreasing. Energy saving and expanding renewable energies are the most feasible and reliable solution to climate change. And nuclear power only drives more energy consumption and strengthens unjust structure of society and create more nuclear waste. And nuclear waste is big reason why we need to stop using nuclear power now. There is no solution to nuclear waste, and my country, Japanese government, has not found any permanent storage for high-level radioactive materials. Human needs to deal with it for thousands of years. It is just transferring burden and responsibility to future generations. I also wanted to talk about radioactive wastewater released into the ocean, but we don't have much time. So if you have any questions about that, you can ask me later. So now we are in climate crisis. We have to take immediate action to change our society. Nuclear is not solution. Nuclear power is deepening inequality by putting more risks on vulnerable communities, workers, and future generations. We have alternatives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ayumi, and thank you for showing also the deep pain in your society as a result of the terrible accident you've had with Fukushima, and also the enormous burden on future generations, because you have no one has found a solution to nuclear waste, and it's not calculated into all the calculations of so-called low CO2 energy production. And we are indeed looking at hundreds of thousands of years of nuclear waste, which have found no solution. So thank you for that. I would like to continue with Angelika Claussen of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. You are a medical doctor. Your organization has also helped, was one of the co-founders of ICANN, and you received a Nobel Peace Prize for that. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about your work?
Yes, thank you very much. I will concentrate on the inextricable link between nuclear power on one side and nuclear weapons on the other side. This is very important and often neglected, and was also neglected in the presentation of the International Energy Agency here. So the statement that our federal organization, IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, put out for the COP26 means nuclear power has no place in a healthy and sustainable future. The goal of this year's COP26 is clear. The world needs to halve emissions over the decade and reach net zero carbon emissions by the middle of the century if we are to limit the global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. So it's crunch time for humanity. But we need to recognize that humanity and the biosphere face another existential crisis of humanity's making, the growing danger of nuclear war. Too few people appreciate that the stable and hospitable climate we need to survive and thrive depends not only on preventing a runaway heating, but also preventing the ice age conditions that would be brought within a few days by a nuclear war, and even a limited nuclear war, only using 100 nuclear weapons in a nuclear war, for instance, between India and Pakistan. This would make us an ice age, and we would have a nuclear famine, which means that about 2 billion people would not have enough to eat and starve of hunger. Nuclear weapons are global suicidal bombs. Therefore, last year, the doomsday clock was moved further forward than it ever had been, only 100 seconds to midnight, with an assessment: the international security situation is now more dangerous than it has ever been, even at the height of the Cold War. So confronted with these two essential dangers, we do not have the luxury of time. And we should make wise choices, act boldly and fast. We need win-win solutions, not measures to address one existential threat, which exacerbates another existential threat. Enrichment plants, which can enrich uranium to both reactor and to weapons grade, and accumulating plutonium in spent reactor fuel, are means of nuclear proliferation and the increasing danger of a nuclear war. So not a climate solution, but a fool's bargain. In the lead up to COP26, there has been another round of concerted and increasingly desperate attempts to portray nuclear power as an acceptable, safe, and low-carbon energy source that can help to address the climate heating crisis. And you have heard it here, I think. We as doctors reject this deception. It's a deception which serves only with a vested interest in the nuclear power industry, and those whose motives is not save low-carbon electricity, but maintaining or being in a position to build nuclear weapons. Nuclear armed states use investments in ostensibly civilian nuclear capacity and infrastructure and training of nuclear scientists and engineers to support their military nuclear program. These governments utilize the civilian nuclear industry for weapons purposes through hidden subsidies involving human resources, research funds, and investments in dual-use nuclear infrastructures. And this is true for all the 9 nuclear weapon countries, for UK here, and in Europe, France, for instance, and Russia, but also China and the United States. So, over the past 2 decades, we have to assume that any economic rationale for nuclear power has long evaporated as renewable energy has become the cheapest, most widely and most quickly available source of new electricity generation worldwide, like the other speaker said before and pointed out before. So we have sun and wind readily available in quantity orders of magnitude greater than human energy consumption. So IPPNW calls on the world's people, on businesses and governments to make the right renewable and efficient choices to deliver the urgent action that humanity and all living things need to turn down the heat on climate crisis in a way that do not avoidably risk catastrophic tragedy and increase the danger of nuclear war. A healthy, safe, secure future can only be renewable, not radioactive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angelika. Now I pass the word to Gavin for a view on the situation in Australia.
Hi, I'm Gavin McLadden. I run the Climate and Energy Program at the Australian Conservation Foundation. I notice there's very little time, so I won't do my expected comments, but what I will say is that the Australian civil society and the environment movement and traditional owners in Australia are alarmed by the presence of the nuclear industry at COP26. We're extremely concerned about the increased presence at this COP by a concerted push for nuclear energy being purported to be a clean energy. In Australia, this has been extremely contentious. I think Australia is the only country in the OECD that doesn't have a nuclear energy industry, but we are one of the world's largest suppliers of uranium, although civil society and traditional owners in Australia have been very effective at containing Australian uranium exports, which are much lower than the substantial reserves we have in Australia could indicate. On the renewable energy front, Australia's future is renewable. It's not nuclear, and despite the push that we've seen at this COP, there's also a push going on at the moment in Australia, and that's been reflected, not the least in which has been the recent decision by the Australian government to abandon a conventional submarines deal with the French in return for a nuclear submarines deal with the UK and the US. That's reignited calls for nuclear energy in Australia. But what I would say is that renewable energy in Australia is the cheapest form of energy that we have. Australia has the best renewable energy resources in the world, and they're rapidly penetrating the Australian energy system. So we see no role for nuclear energy in Australia. It's heavily contested on environmental grounds, on cost grounds, and the destruction that uranium mining has on natural and cultural values in Australia. It's a mining operation that has been unilaterally contested by traditional owners in Australia, by civil society, and by the environment movement. Just finally, what I would say is that there's a major new push in Australia to approve Australia's first major radioactive waste dump, starting with low and intermediate level waste, but there is a concern that because of Australia's stable politics and geology that we could become a repository for global radioactive waste, and all I can say about that is that that will meet the strongest resistance by the Australian public, by civil society and by traditional owners in Australia. So we see a shrinking uranium sector in Australia, not an expanding one. And will be very strongly advocating in Australia, as we will be for our position that we can anywhere in the world, that renewable energy is the future of the energy systems in a decarbonised world, not nuclear energy. And it is completely untrue to characterise nuclear energy as clean just because it's lower emissions than other fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and this gives us 2 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions from the press or from online participants? Yes, go ahead. Do we have a mic? Yeah, we have a mic.
Hello, my name is Legend from ESDZ, Netherlands. I would like to ask, the energy density of nuclear is very high, For the same, we'll have to use a lot of land resources and water. So how can you compensate for that?
Okay, so I think the question is really about how to produce the energy, and I think the renewables can give us the solution for that. So I give you the
Well,
answer to
absolutely.
that.
I mean, I can talk about the Australian context. Renewable energy is responsive in a way that nuclear energy is not. And as Australia is the case, as in many countries where households are becoming their own batteries and dispersers of renewable energy back into the grid, the Australian energy system is going through a revolution because we are the largest household solar. We have the highest take-up of household solar anywhere in the world, and that's transforming our energy system. So now households in Australia are becoming power stations in themselves. So that's becoming, energy systems in Australia and in many countries are becoming decentralised, and nuclear energy is another attempt to centralise our energy system. So it seems to be counterintuitive, certainly in the Australian context and for many countries, to go through down that kind of path when it's the opposite of what we're seeing in a climate change affected world, when we're seeing decentralised energy solutions, not centralised ones.
Thank you very much. So for any further questions, please join us outside of the room. And I would like to thank all our experts and participants to this meeting, and see you outside. Thank you. Bye-bye.